It's nice to meet you on Zoom. You're Kenneth Van Wey, Programs Director for the
Program specialist.
Program Specialist for
Right.
the American Indian Arts and Crafts Board.
Yes.
And so I don't know if you wanted to explain a little bit about what the role of the board is and also who needs to know about the American Indian Arts and Crafts Act and why.
Sure. So the Indian Arts and Crafts Board is a federal agency within the United States Department of the Interior. We work to promote economic development for American Indian artists and communities through the expansion of the Indian arts and crafts market and through our various outreach and education programs and through our work with the Indian Arts and Crafts Act. So we'll get into the Indian Arts and Crafts Act in a little bit more detail, I'm sure. But in general, though, the board, in addition to that Arts and Crafts Act work, as a general arts promotion agency, we do publish a source directory online of American Indian and Alaska Native owned and operated arts and crafts businesses. And artists and businesses that are interested in getting an entry can go to our website, and there's information on what the eligibility requirements are and an entry form. We have 3 museums serving Indian country. They're small regional museums. We have one in Rapid City, South Dakota, which is the Sioux Indian Museum, which is located in a larger museum complex called The Journey. We have the Southern Plains Indian Museum in Anadarko, Oklahoma, and we have the Museum of the Plains Indian in Browning, Montana, which is on the Blackfeet Reservation.
Neat.
And we also use those museums to promote our arts and crafts activities, in addition to promoting contemporary, authentic Indian arts and crafts. So we do rotating sales exhibitions at those museums featuring artists, some of them getting their first show, where we publish an exhibition monograph for them, give them gallery space.
I noticed that you also have a newsletter called Treasures. Is that right? Or
Oh, that's sort of a general update thing that one of my coworkers does. The Indian Arts and Crafts Board, in addition to well, the Indian Arts and Crafts Board itself, since its establishment, has been focused on contemporary Indian art and artists. But after you do that for a while, the contemporary becomes historic. So we have a lot of material in our collections that is now historic that was at one time contemporary. And Lars has been going through and taking a look at some of those works and familiarizing the public with them, which is especially important now when people can't visit our museums.
yeah, I noticed that is current, the last one in May. So
Right.
I could have spent a long time on the website. There's a lot of stuff there. So I found a lot of really interesting uh, artists and the legislation. I just went over and over again. Um, so I wanted to find out from your perspective what you think the economic implications of the legislation are. How does it benefit Native artists, and how do artists find resources for taking legal action to protect their intellectual property? Of course, the economic factor is one of the reasons that American Indian art is imitated, right?
Right. So yes, so the Indian Arts and Crafts Board currently estimates that the total value of the arts and crafts industry, or of the Indian arts and crafts industry in the United States, is around $1.5 billion. So there is a lot of money involved, uh, but there's no way we can really know beyond that sort of very loose estimate how much of that market is controlled by Indian artists, how much of it is authentic, how much of it is inauthentic, because it is just would require an agency with a much better statistical bureau than we have access to get that information. But it's a huge market. There's a lot of money. So yes, the act was intended to protect the livelihoods and the creative works of Indian artists and also of their communities from unfair competitive practices. And especially with the focus of the 1990 Act and following on the misrepresentation of imported or counterfeited craft work that's being represented as Indian made.
Right. You mentioned the livelihood, and some of the resources that are out there on this talk about how imitations of American Indian art can be made much more cheaply because they aren't necessarily using the materials that American Indian artisans use uh, when we gather and when we source our materials. We spend a lot more time in a lot of cases doing that, so that you can get something that is imitation for a lot less. But if everybody does that, the artists who are practicing the traditional styles don't get that money, even though it's because of their work that those items are sought after.
Yes, I would agree. I think that the combination of the value of labor, not, I'm not an economist, I might be imprecisely using terms of art here, but yes, the value of labor that an artist puts into a work, the general wage standards in the United States are higher than in some of the countries where these imports are being generated. It is possible that there's the materials cost, but with something like silver, that's a fairly standard cost. It is possible people are using lower quality silver in some cases, but really the labor cost itself, based on the prevailing wages where you're doing the work, are important in that price factor, and also just sort of the abstract concept or quality of Indianness, which you can't put your finger on it, you can't weigh it, you can't count it, but it does have a value that adds to the work for the cultural connection, for the value to the communities, for the value to collectors, and for its inherent aesthetic value.
Right. I thought about what if somebody outside of the culture who is not related in any way were to try to make something that they thought represented Indianness, and then it gets perpetuated by whoever purchases that item, and whoever sees it in their home or wherever they keep it, so that um, it just reinforces stereotypes. I would
Yes,
think that it would be possible for that to happen.
yes. The problem goes well beyond the initial point of sale for something like that, because then that also creates the aesthetic expectation for artists, or as we talked about, the price expectation that legitimate artists have to try and meet in order to compete in the marketplace with those. But the act is very particularly a truth in marketing law. So we can't prevent people from making dream catchers or baskets, but we can work hard with everybody to ensure that the baskets that are being sold or the dream catchers that are being sold in the marketplace as Indian or as the product of a particular Indian tribe are actually that.
And so I wanted to find out what is covered by this act, because now we've got so much more use of the internet, and graphic design I think might be something that people are curious about. I have always been interested in music, and I'm not sure if the act covers that yet, or if it is intended for that at all. The creative works of American Indians.
Yeah, so the act generally covers contemporary or traditional art or craft products, so physical goods produced after 1935. The act does not at this time cover literary works, musical works, recordings of musical works, storytelling sessions, or interpretive presentations. It strictly covers, at this point, the sale of physical arts and crafts items.
That makes sense.
So I guess when we get into graphic design, that's kind of, that would really have to be sort of a case by case sort of thing. Certainly the files themselves are probably not protected by the act because they don't exist as they're more of a recording than they are of an object. Prints, depending on how they're sold, how they're marketed, how they're made, may or may not be considered an art or craft product for purposes of the act. And I would really hate to let people feel that something is covered if it might not be, but also not discourage people from raising their voice if they are a graphic designer whose work is being ripped off. At the very least, if the act would not cover it, I would imagine that copyright would, and that they would still be able to assert their copyright rights to get some sort of redress.
Hmm. Yeah, I
Oh, and
was.
this is probably also a good point in time for me to mention that I'm not an attorney.
Me either. So, I think that with something like I think a graphic design, like a logo and things like that, I've looked into getting those trademarked or copyrighted through the is it the trade office, the United States Trade Office. And so I know that music also is one of those things that people, there's a more, a non-American Indian specific way to protect those. Um,
Right.
but this act, you mentioned it's, it has been intended to prevent import of artwork. Uh, and I wonder how the internet has also changed that, because now we can order things from around the world, and an American Indian truth in advertising law won't extend to the sellers in another country. They don't even have to leave their
All
their
right. So,
country.
yeah, so the Indian Arts and Crafts Act regulates sales of stuff within the United States, but it is as generally interpreted through our work with other organizations and just the general application of this to internet commerce. Somebody in a foreign country who is selling to somebody in the United States by way of the internet is still establishing a connection enough to the United States that
Oh.
the Indian Arts and Crafts Act should apply for purposes of that sale. Now, whether or not we can actually enforce it against them in that case is sort of a thing to be worked out, but just because they're in another country does not make them untouchable, or does that certainly if somebody in a, we often have this where somebody in a foreign country is selling something through, say, eBay or Etsy. The board works with eBay and Etsy, who are United States based companies, to regulate some of the sales that are occurring on their sites. So we can, by working with those the actual platforms that people are selling on, we can do some things to bring people into compliance, because we do have the support of those platforms, and the Indian Arts and Crafts Act is actually written into their codes of conduct.
Wow. Okay. I should have read that. I've,
Generally, the importation, anybody overseas can make something that's an Indian style product, and they can ship it to the United States. There is a series of customs regulations that require that Indian style art and craft work and Indian style jewelry in particular that are imported to the United States have indelible markings indicating their country of origin. In practice, there are other regulations that indicate, depending on the size and fragility of the object, that people can use stickers or hang tags. Stickers or hang tags are used, and in some cases, once those products enter the United States, these stickers or hang tags somehow magically vanish. So there are rules, there are regulations, there are laws that apply to that in general. And then when it's really the specifics are where it all matters.
And some of the specifics, the legislation itself mentions written verification, and it's a truth in advertising law that I wonder how tricky the wording gets, and how do people learn to identify somebody who is uh, kind of being tricky with those words.
Okay. So the act prohibits the offer or display for sale or the sale of an art or craft work in a manner that falsely suggests it's Indian produced, an Indian product, or the product of a particular Indian or Indian tribe, or Indian arts and crafts organization resident within the United States. So generally the way the board interprets that and the way it's written into the regulations is that if somebody makes unqualified use of the term Indian, Native American, the name of a particular Indian tribe like Navajo or Cherokee, or ascribes something to a particular artist, that needs to be a true statement. But the sellers of non-Indian produced goods will often use qualifiers to it, and that is allowed under the law. Like they'll describe something as Native American style, Indian inspired, or they will just refer to jewelry as Southwestern or something. And it will have that distinctive Southwestern Indianish look, but it's not Indian made, and they are not claiming that it is Indian made. So
Okay.
that does give the room for Indian artists under the act to more clearly proclaim who they are without any of those qualifiers in a way that the other folks can't. And that is a way that they can differentiate it. If they want to identify their work with their tribe or provide more details about themselves so that potential buyers can follow up on the provenance, then that can help consumers further down the way figure out whether something is or is not legitimate.
I think that sometimes when people buy Native American art or American Indian art, that they want to learn about that. They want to learn about the culture. Ideally, it's from a local vendor who has sourced all of their materials locally, and it speaks about what native tribe was there. That's one of the things that we have in California, a lot of different traditions, and we have a lot of different materials to work with. So I think that California is really amazing, and some local businesses, local jurisdictions like states, and even I was learning about Santa Fe has its own specific local legislations that help to support this federal law. And um, I wonder, how is that kind of always evolving and expanding, how people are working within their own tribes and cities and states to really make sure that the same principles are there and enforceable locally?
Absolutely. In my time at the board, I have seen a lot more education for the public and a lot more general awareness of the issues. People ask more questions. As you say, several states have amended their several states, I think it's about 12. I'd have to have access to my office to give you the exact number without going down a countdown, but I believe it's between 12 and 14 states have their own state laws. Some, like Maine, just passed their laws within the last few years.
Wow.
Others, like New Mexico, have had their act on the books since the 70s, but during my time here, they've amended it to bring it up, to catch up more with the times, which is what Congress did with the 1990 Act, too.
Was was it amended in 1990 or was it amended since then?
The original Arts and Crafts Act was passed in 1935. It
Oh, that's the
board, it established the penalties, which actually I can jump the gun on one of your other questions too, which is yes, so the board was established in 1935. Prior to that, there was not a law against falsely selling things as Indian made in the United States. So that's the reason for the 1935 cutoff in the 1990 Act, or in our regulations rather. So the Indian Arts and Crafts Act was passed in 1935. It was amended in 1990 to create stronger criminal and civil penalties under the act as to more clearly define who an Indian was, because the earlier act had not clearly defined who an Indian would or would not be for purposes of that act. So they expanded the penalties and tightened up some of the definitions for the act. In 2000, they amended the act again.
um I
And
wasn't sure.
2010.
I wasn't sure about that history, and so I thought it might have to do with the some of the other historical things that were happening with American Indian tribes, like the Indian Reorganization Act that happened around then too. So thank you for explaining
Okay.
that.
Oh, I can actually talk a little bit more about that. We have a few years ago, we did a history of the Indian Arts and Crafts Act presentation. So I have a few of those facts rattling around. So there's actually a book out there. I think the author's name is Utley, but I would have to look it up to make sure, who wrote a history of the Indian Arts and Crafts Board's initial years that I believe was published by University of New Mexico Press. But John Collier, who was the head of the Bureau of Indian Affairs, or who was Commissioner of Indian Affairs under Roosevelt at that time, is both the man who worked to get the Indian Reorganization Act through and one of the key players in getting the Indian Arts and Crafts Act through. So they're not directly tied legislatively, but a lot of the same congressmen, senators, and political officials were involved in both laws.
I think every so often there we have politicians and federal employees who take an interest and do good things. So um, I was interested since in California, some tribes have disenrolled members, and um, I was wondering what effect that has had on what the board is doing and maybe what people are considering about the legislation to, um, you know, uh, if there was an artist, for instance, who was working as an artist before they were disenrolled and using uh, that term, the distinction of an American Indian artist, then that artist becomes disenrolled. What impact does that have on their ability to market using this act? Are they still able to use the term American Indian made for their work prior to disenrollment? And then what can they do going forward?
Okay, here's where I must once again remind people that I am not an attorney and strongly recommend that anybody in a situation like this work with an attorney. But as far as I can tell, and as through my understanding of the act and talking about this a little bit, having had the question in advance, the act isn't retroactive. Both it didn't apply to stuff created before 1935, and in this case, somebody who's selling work that was made by somebody who was an Indian when they made the work, that work should be considered an Indian product for purposes of the act. In all likelihood, I think maybe a court would determine that, or somebody would have to tighten the, somebody would have to issue a clear ruling or something. But my current interpretation would be that that person was an Indian artist at the time, so that work would be a piece of Indian art.
Yeah.
Following up on that, no, they couldn't continue to market their work after they were disenrolled as Indian, Native American, or as a product of a particular Indian tribe. That wouldn't prohibit them under federal law, although there might be some cultural standards involved for producing any particular work or a particular style of work. So they could continue doing what they do. It would only affect how they are able to market it. And the act is a truth in marketing law, so it doesn't prevent somebody from making a truthful statement. So in the course of their sale, they can address the fact that they're a disenrolled member of a tribe. They can maybe use that as a launching point to discuss disenrollment as an issue, or however they want to handle it. They just can't unqualified say Navajo, Native American, Indian. They could refer to their heritage perhaps, unless that's the point where they, okay, that's where I'm really veering off, so let's stop that. So yes, if it's a truthful statement, they can make it. So it will probably cause some problems as far as marketing, but it doesn't prevent them from selling their work at all. Just selling it as Indian in an unqualified manner.
I think in California, we've been working within those lines for a long time because there are people who haven't been enrolled with their tribes. There are tribes that have not been federally recognized, and now there are disenrollments. So I think the courts could do a lot to work all of that stuff out if people can make those cases. And I was wondering if you have any advice for artists who might need legal services to protect their intellectual property from counterfeit.
Okay, in the case where they feel that they're facing some sort of Indian Arts and Crafts Act violation, where somebody is selling work as theirs, selling work as Indian made when it's not, something like that, we recommend that they contact the Indian Arts and Crafts Board. We can be reached through a toll-free telephone line at 888-ART-FAKE, or we can be reached by email, by email at iacb@ios.goi.gov, or we can be reached through our website, where we have a complaint form set up that people can fill out a lot of more detailed information, which is really the recommended means right now, at www.doi.gov/IACB/act.
Thank you. Yep.
Oh yeah, and then for general stuff, we have a publication we put together with the Federal Trade Commission a few years ago that we may be editing soon, but is up there in a PDF online, or people can contact our office for physical copies, on intellectual property protection for American Indian and Alaska Native artists. That's got information on copyright, trademark, in addition to the act. And I have one more little recommendation, that volunteer lawyers for the arts. They're not active in every state the way they used to be, but they still have several active chapters, and they're a good place to go for legal advice for artists. And state arts councils often have legal referral services too.
California has one. California Lawyers for the Arts. Well, they're starting to pick up the all of the bins right now. So I just had one more question. I wanted to know who, if there's a kind of trivia, is who is the most imitated American Indian artist, our famous uh, artist who gets imitated all the time? I have some guesses. I don't know if it's.
Okay. I am, as far as just aesthetic imitation, I am not certain. But as far as, so what, a lot of what we get, and certainly what we're seeing in the arts and crafts market, is not so much the imitation of particular artists or the sale of work as particular famous artists, that it generally tends to be just generically Navajo or something, or ascribing things to potentially made up individuals. But there have been a few cases that have involved work sold as the work of major artists. There is a case right now that is going through the courts in New Mexico over the sale of, allegedly, because we're still at that point, counterfeited work by Hopi jeweler Charles Lolema.
Oh wow.
I did not know about Charles Lolema, so I looked him up. Because counterfeiters know how to exploit artists whose work can fetch a high price, even though most people can't distinguish their work from a fake. By educating ourselves and others, we can keep counterfeiters at bay. Here are some photos of the real thing, work by Charles Lolema, courtesy of marthastruver.com.
There are press releases available on our website and through a U.S. Fish and Wildlife Services law enforcement website that are the press releases as these cases unroll and unfold. So you can check there to get updates as it moves along.
Okay, well, thank you very much. And I guess artists can contact you guys. You've already given the contact information for people to reach you with concerns, maybe suggestions for what in their experience they can think of is needed. So I want to thank you for taking the time to
Oh,
talk
thank you
about
very
this,
much.
help educate all of us on this.
Yeah, if anybody has any questions or wants to get in touch with us, they can. We're always glad to talk to Indian artists and help them address their concerns, even if they fall a little bit outside of the act.
Yeah, okay, great. Thank you.
All right, thank you very much.